Hey everybody, how's it going? Corey Wakefield here with another V2 element video for you all, and we're going to be talking about the graphic partial in this video. Now, the graphic partial was actually not a partial in the initial release of our V2 elements. If you were using the header or footer builders in Pro for a while now, you have seen this graphic control grouping within buttons, toggles, things like that. But we kind of realized that we could take this idea of a little graphic, a little design flourish that you might want to the side or above some text or something. We can kind of abstract that out and reuse it in different contexts. So as of this release, the graphic is now a partial. It's not just in anchors, but it is also being used in, at least for right now, just the headline. So we're going to kind of walk through how the graphic differentiates itself between different anchors, how it's going to work in situations like a headline versus a button, things like that, and just kind of go through the control grouping because we've also added a bunch of new controls for styling the graphic in different ways. So without further ado, we will just jump right in here. So the first thing you'll notice is that the graphic has been revamped a little bit to where it has this enable checkbox, and if you turn it off completely, it will hide all those controls. And this is a direction we're kind of trying to move in to keep things a little more siloed so that we can easily take these control sets and drop them in where we need, and you'll be used to the same flow layout whenever you're using them from one element to the next. The next control to be aware of after that is the type selection. So effectively with the graphic, you've got icons, images, and then toggles. So icons would be, this hand right here that you're seeing, which we can swap out if we're using a secondary one. We can use images. So if I were to switch over here, turn on both my images. All right, so now we're using an image for our graphic. And then the third type to be aware of would be going to an actual toggle for something that triggers something like a modal or an off-canvas area. And if I go to that graphic, you'll notice that the type selection has a third type now, which is the toggle type. And clicking that essentially brings up this one box here where we have the option to choose between a few different toggle types. We've got a burger, which you can specify all the parameters, got a little grid, and then the more options. And so keep in mind that that third type is available for anything that toggles something. And it really is, they're better indicators that something is toggleable. But of course, if you want to use, an icon for a toggle, you can absolutely do that as well. So jumping back over to the button, just one second. Let's just kind of start with the next control here, and then we'll run through each different type. Now the next thing you'll see is this icon and image interaction select, which is only present on graphics that are within elements where you can interact with them. So for example, buttons, menu items, toggles. You won't find this in the graphic options for the headline, because with headlines, you're really just reading it. You might need to copy and paste it or do something like that, but you're not going to be hovering over it, focusing on it, interacting with it, clicking to go somewhere. So these are really just used as an augmentation, a little animation that can create some engagement for users to understand that oh, maybe I'm supposed to click on this thing. And that's kind of the same as it was before. We've just moved it here so that it's more readily able to be moved around across different elements. The next option you'll see is the graphic margin. That is the spacing around the graphic itself. As you know from some of our other videos, we also have a text margin, which goes around the text. And the reason why we do that in these presets is so that you could play around with, after assigning the preset, going to the content flex layout, for example, and trying a reversed layout or using a column layout, putting that back on top. If we didn't have the 4 pixels on each one, depending on which way you move stuff around, it might look a little off. So definitely once you get an idea of the look you want to use for a preset or for a button, you might want to look into, removing the margin from your text, maybe removing the margin from all of the graphic sides. And then since my graphic, let's say I've decided I know I want to have a graphic on the left and a text, a bit of text on the right, then I might just add a little bit of margin on my graphic to space that out. And then what's great about having the margin off my text and the margin only on my graphic is turning that off means I won't have any extra margin around my text and my button. And then if I decide, I do want to bring that graphic back in, it will have the appropriate spacing when it shows up. So just kind of something to keep in mind. And then we also have, these sides. It's also helpful for if you need to align an icon or an image that doesn't quite look visually like it's lining up with maybe a font you're using or some other type of setup. Sometimes your image could be visually or it could be literally centered vertically. But visually it might look a little off once you actually get it into your markup. So this is great for, making little adjustments here or there, 1 pixel, 2 pixel, just getting things right where you need it to be. So after the margin, and that will apply for all graphic types. So if you hit icon, image, or toggle in a toggle scenario. Next we have the icon controls, which will be again, a little different based on if you're in something that you can interact with or not. If you are in something that you can interact with, like a button or a toggle, you will see this secondary switch to turn the secondary icon on or off. And again, that's basically the hover icon. And you can select either of those. And then you'll also have these hover states. So I've got kind of a different color here for my hover, or I could change that to a white. So you can play around with those differently than a heading per se, where you'll notice basically you have the font size available, no secondary checkbox, you got your width and height like normal, and then each row there, the icon, the color, the background, it's just one because we're not interacting with it, we're just styling it in a singular sense. So jump back over to my button. So those are pretty straightforward, easy to play around with. And basically what was there before. Now we did really open up the styling set for the graphics with the icons in that you can now add borders, border radius, box shadow, do a lot more with how that icon ultimately looks. So for example, let me just take this icon and we'll leave that font size there and we'll bump up the width and height because we're going to add a slight background here, and I'm just kind of playing around with this off the cuff. So let's say we want this background. Actually, let's try a dark one. I think that might stand out a little better. All right, perfect. So again, we've got our backgrounds that we can now set on icons. And again, that could be different when you hover, just to see it. Get back here. You can now add borders to the icon. So let's say we actually want to leave this all the same at a solid border, 2 pixels. Let's just do the same RGB value. We can do border radius. So now we've got a little circle going. And then we can add some box shadows. So 1.5, might do 0.5 here. You'll see that box shadow appearing. Now for this particular look, maybe we'll inset it. Get a little more subtle here. And again, you can change the box shadow color on hover. So we've got a lot more options to actually style our icons in very different ways than we did before. Previously, all you had available were the color basically and the text shadow to maybe match the text of your button. But now you can really make some fully designed little icons and play around with that. And I just did that off the cuff. There's tons of stuff you can play around with. One kind of interesting thing you can do too is the way the graphic is set up, the icon is actually kind of positioned absolutely within the space that this occupies. So for example, if I put this back down to 2, we could make a border that was 1em. This is kind of an interesting trick, but then let's use something like the ridge here. Actually, I think it's inset. Okay, so inset, like these border types here, this is just kind of an interesting thing that I discovered when we were working on it. These inset, outset, ridge, groove types, they kind of take the color that you assign as a base, and they kind of do some color magic where they'll add another color. And I don't know quite the computation that they're using to set up, this secondary color, but it's kind of an interesting way to get some different effects. So you might have something like that. That's the inset. Outset effectively swaps it. And then ridge and groove kind of like double up on it. If I make my icon transparent, you can kind of see what's going on there. And these are just interesting kind of approaches that potentially you could use for getting a certain look. Like that diagonal look is kind of cool to play around with the icon. So just to say too, for borders, basically the border will not affect the width of your graphic. So if you set up a width, it'll be exactly 2ems, and the border will move inward based on what you're setting up there. Let me just put this back. All right. So that is icons. And again, lots you can do now with that, now that you have all of those styling options available to set backgrounds and colors and all that. Images are effectively the same as they were before. You select an image, kind of like we did earlier. You've got your main image. You can set up a secondary image. You'll toggle that on here. And remember that always your images need to be the same size because of the way they're positioned. And we do have this max width option that you can use. And that's for if you happen to have an image that you're putting in that's a little bit bigger than you might want visually. You can just use that to size things down just a little bit. It's great for maybe SVGs, stuff like that as well. Just for those little scenarios where maybe you need to size the image down just a little bit more. Next, we will move over to our toggle. As mentioned earlier, and as you've kind of seen before, we have our toggle type, and nothing is new here. We basically have the same old controls, exact same configurations, no new colors or anything here, because the focus is on the toggle element itself. And then as mentioned earlier, graphics inside of elements that you can't really interact with, so like text. You'll notice we don't have the select down here to choose an interaction. We just have singular colors, icons, sizes to play around with. But we can still do all of the same, the border radius, box shadow, the border if we wanted one. All of that is at your disposal when using that graphic inside of a headline. And same thing, we can do images. Same thing here, we only get one image, right, for the headline. So anything you want to output, but basically it's just whatever image you design is how it will be output. And then again, what's really cool about this is the new headline, and I'll be going into this in a little more detail for our text video that I'll be making a little addendum to. But similarly to the button or the toggle, we can now play around, and just to see how this looks a little better, I'm just going to add like 5 pixels to the text. Let's just do like 7. And for this graphic, we'll do 7 pixels. Now, again, this is just so I can see when I'm swapping stuff around here. But we can reverse this layout. We can do a column. And then again, we can play with the alignment of that stuff. So for example, we actually might want to reverse this. I can move this back to the start, move that icon to the end. So there's a lot you can do with simply playing with these layouts and how they work within here. If I put a max width on here, I might do 100 pixels. Oop, that's way too tiny. Let's do 400. Notice vertically I can put my icon to the start, to the end, to the center. And again, I'll be going in all this in a lot more detail in our text video, but just wanted to run through some of those things here for you guys to get a idea of what has changed there. And we hope that you guys have found this helpful. So thank you very much, and tune in again for our next video.